Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to our new series on looking ahead at real estate and construction, brought to you by BDO in Australia. My name is Andres Reith. I am BDO's National Real Estate and Construction Leader, and in our webinar today, we'll be discussing the future of the office space. An exciting topic. We had a bit of a warm-up with the panelists beforehand, and it was quite heated and very exciting, so I'm looking forward to this discussion. But before we kick things off, I'd just like to draw your attention to the housekeeping slide that's currently showing. You'll obviously all be muted automatically, but we will be accepting questions using that question button there on the screen. Look, we will have question and answer time at the end. If we don't get to all the questions, we will follow up with you later, and there will be a recording made available as well, so no one should miss out. So yes, with that, let's get going. So today, the future of office. So the last 2 years have been very interesting, to say the least, hasn't it? I mean, the question of the importance of the office space has been looked at right from the word go. In March 20, we thought it's all going to go to dust, and we'll all be working at home or at the beach or in our pajamas for forever going forward. But unfortunately, what seemed exciting to some at the start has really turned into drudgery and maybe even burnout for some. So I think the concept of the office space is still an important one, and today we'll be going into a bit more detail around that. Unfortunately, I don't think we're at the new normal just yet, so we're still guessing at what the new normal could look like. So yes, we're seeing more and more people come back into the CBDs, which is great. More and more meetings are happening face to face, which feels great. On the other hand, there's benefits from staying at home, especially if you've got kids or other things that you need to get done at home, like the tradie needing to come in. It's great to have some flexibility. On the other hand, it's great to come into the office as well. So how will this play out in the future? And what does it mean for employees, for employers, and for landlords, which is important to us in the real estate space? Today, I want to focus not just on the built environment of the office space, but also the human element. And so I'm quite excited about discussing all those aspects with you today. So with me on the webinar is Jordan Suka. You can see him on the screen there. He's a general manager of new business and group services at Buildcorp. You probably have heard of Buildcorp. They are a commercial construction business specializing in new build, refurbishment, remedial, and workplace fit-outs. They service the east coast of Australia and are one of the most respected and well-known construction businesses in the commercial real estate space. Jordan focuses on corporate services at Buildcorp, including the finance function, corporate social responsibility, but is also involved with new business, where he gets to meet new clients and understand their vision for their own office space. So great to have you on board, Jordan. Thank you.
Thanks, Andres.
I'm also delighted to welcome Sarah Hughes, who's the National Director of Tenant Advisory and Occupier Services. And let me just find a bit about Sarah. Sarah has 13 years experience and has represented both landlords and tenants across Australia and UK. Currently working for Colliers. For the last 7 years, Sarah has worked as a tenant advisor across all Australian markets with a particular focus on Sydney. Sarah has established herself as an expert in the Sydney markets and has recently worked with Macquarie Bank, Westpac, Goldman Sachs, and Microsoft. Prior to working with Colliers, Sarah was seconded to British Airways and managed a portfolio optimization strategy across their global portfolio, including projects in EMEA, USA, and Asia Pac. Great to have you on the call, Sarah.
Thank you for the warm introduction.
Great. And we also have Janine Waters from our own BDO office. Janine Waters is the National Leader in People Advisory, joining us today to provide an input from the people side. Janine partners with organisations to design and implement business-driven people solutions. Her focus is on HR effectiveness, organisational effectiveness, change management, and virtual HR support. Welcome everyone, and thank you Janine for joining us.
Thanks, Andreas.
Now welcome everyone, and thank you for joining me today at this very special webinar.
Oh, Sarah, one of those new technologies we have to save energy.
I know,
Don't
I feel like I haven't moved for too long. I do apologize.
We'll have
Yes,
to get you moving, Sarah.
I know.
So initially I thought we'd start off with just understanding the state of play at the moment. So to give everyone an introductory comment, maybe Janine, you can start off with just explaining what we're seeing at BDO. You know, what's the current situation at BDO from an office perspective?
Thanks, Andreas. So from a BDO perspective, I think we're in a position where I'm seeing actually many of our clients going through the same. We're out of lockdown, which is amazing, and we have the opportunity to start coming back into the office. But I think employees and management are really trying to find what's that sweet spot of what the future looks like. So we have a real mix. We've got some people who are back full time and loving it. We have some people who I don't think we've seen back since the last lockdown, or if we have it maybe once or twice. And I think we're in that phase of really trying to understand what does the future of flexible work look like for our organisation, and how will it play out. So we've probably got about 30% of our staff in on any given day, obviously very different to pre-COVID.
No, thanks, Janine. Jordan, how are you seeing that play out at Billcorp and some of the clients maybe that you're seeing?
Yeah, I guess probably starting with the client side of things. So we're seeing a lot of refurbs of existing office buildings at the moment. So not as many fit outs around, just a little bit of a lag, I guess, from that initial kind of COVID period where people weren't really sure what they wanted, but there is a bit of a pipeline of fit outs on the horizon for us. But landlords are also having to make their buildings more attractive then to attract those new, those kind of new potential tenants. In terms of the fit outs themselves, more meeting rooms, more open space, probably not cramming as many people into an office as we maybe once were, with all the new kind of square meter rules and the like, and more collaboration and less desks. In terms of Billcorp, we're in a pretty interesting spot, which I'll touch on a bit later. But yeah, we've got obviously two completely different workforces. The sites, so we've got 450 staff, about 370 site-based, or maybe 350 are site-based, and the other 100 are office-based. So it's how we kind of juggle the flexible nature. It's pretty hard to be flexible in a lot of site roles. Not all, some can have flexibility, but the site supervisor literally needs to be there physically supervising work. So it's kind of how we juggle all of that in a fair way. So that's kind of our challenge at the moment.
It's interesting seeing that the two-tiered workforce. That'll be interesting, and we'll go into a bit more detail later on that. Sarah, what are you seeing in terms of your clientele and colliers?
Yeah, it's very varied in terms of what we're seeing. So I think if we look back a couple of years, or even through 2020 and 2021, the majority of our tenants were really looking to renew their leases, where this year there seems to be a little bit of reinvigoration, and there's a lot more excitement around companies exploring a relocation. And the main focus on that is really how they can attract staff back to the office. So I think there's a huge recognition now that there needs to be more on offer than just the traditional workplace, and a new office environment that's exciting and bright and fun is going to encourage people back into the office. So that's definitely huge with what we're seeing. From a collier's perspective, I would say we're close to 80% occupancy on any given day. There is certainly more flexibility in how we work now than what there was pre-COVID. I think just by virtue of what it is that we do, though, that the majority of people have a need to be in the office, and to be going out and meeting with clients. And it's hard to inspect a building virtually. So if you're in the city and you can actually walk through that space, it's a lot easier to do your job and advise clients.
Excellent. No, it's definitely good to be back in person, and we look forward to the day when we can do this webinar in person and sit, in a panel across from each other. But it's interesting to see the varying responses and the issues that we need to concern ourselves with as we look at the future of office space. I'd like to turn our attention, just going back 2 years now, to see where we were at or where the market was at prior to COVID. Obviously, COVID hit us and we're surprised by it. We didn't see it coming, but there was obviously a future of office space in 2020 that we had envisioned for ourselves and for our companies. So Sarah, do you want to just turn your mind back to early 2020 and seeing what people were doing then?
Yeah, sure. So I think to set the scene pre-2020, the 5 years prior, we'd actually seen effective rental growth of 50%, which was huge. So vacancy was at an all-time low and one of the lowest levels since the GFC. It was about 3.7%. And it was, I mean, that was a result of a number of buildings that were withdrawn for metro projects, hotel developments, and also just refurbishment. But because of that, there was a real drive from employers and businesses to drive the, I guess, maximum efficiencies of a floor and what an office could support. So what we really saw pre-COVID was a drive to secure that 1 employee per 8 square meters to maximize the number of people that they could squeeze onto a floor. So that's a huge change in terms of what we're seeing right now. So you've got the increase in rent and the reduction in vacancy that we saw pre-2020. And because of that, I think the squeeze is what promoted a lot of those efficiencies within the floor plate as well. But we also saw other organizations that were essentially land banking office space, if I can say that. So prior to COVID, I think organizations looked at their medium to long-term growth strategies and thought, we need to just take this space on the off chance, or not the off chance, but the forecast that we are going to grow, and we need to have it there and available and ready for them. And really what we've seen since COVID is it's actually a lot of this space that's really coming back to market as sublease space. I think I've gone a roundabout way in answering your question, but essentially at the beginning of COVID, the market was very, very, very tight for occupiers. That's probably the crux of the issue.
Interesting, which is an interesting benchmark to work off from. But Janine, I'm interested also in the people space that you look at. What were the reactions? Well, what's the environment like in early 2020 around people advisory? What were people looking for? Were they already talking about flexibility back then?
Look, I think there was a lot of talk about flexibility, and as Sarah said, there was a lot of looking at how we can maximize workspaces, so agile working environments. And you'll remember, Andreas, we had gone to agile working ourselves at BDO a few years prior, and we'd done a pretty humdrum job of it. Everybody had kind of gone back to having their own desks, and then all of a sudden we were seeing the need again, and we were trying to really get that agile work mindset happening. But what I would say is there were really diverse perspectives on what flexible work looked like then. So yes, there was a call for agile working, but there wasn't a real consistency in terms of flexible working arrangements. They were still probably the exception rather than the rule, and we still had fairly rigorous processes in place that people kind of had to justify what flexible work arrangements they might like and have a plan to show you what work they'd be doing from home and how they would be doing it and how they wouldn't impact others. Whilst there are some, more innovative organisations that were on that pathway to more agile work, I would say it was still pretty clunky, and they still seem to be that the majority of people expected to be working the majority of their working week in the office to some degree or another.
Certainly not the 100% from home that we saw from April onwards.
If I think of myself, I had my home office at that point, and I probably used it about once a month if I got lucky.
That's it. Jordan, I wouldn't mind understanding your view of the flexible work arrangement that you might have seen in office fit outs. Yes, we've been talking about agile, even hot desking was a concept from 10 years back. What did you see in office fit outs at the time of before March 2020 that you could even see that COVID was just an accelerator of something that was going to happen anyway?
Well, I guess, from the actual office fit out perspective, the offices, as in I'm talking individual cubicle offices, and most major organisations have been dead for the last 5 or 6 years as everyone's moved to that kind of completely open plan open plan space. And in terms of how that actually, early on in the pandemic, it was kind of one of the first things people said was that a mistake? Like, do we need offices? Do we need walls up and physical barriers and the like? Certainly, though, the goal was to maximize number of desks. That was one of the original the logic behind getting rid of the offices and having kind of whole rows and rows of desks was to obviously the collaboration side, but also to maximize floor print, that they're actually able to use it and minimize rent for businesses. So that was what we were seeing was the main focus from a client perspective, just to open up as much as possible. Now it's more how do we make it a combination of safe, but also the collaboration spaces and the like. But we'll touch on that, I'm sure, later on.
No, that's good to understand. It's an interesting benchmark to see what was happening in 2020. So then obviously lockdown happened. And it's interesting to see now, I read some of the articles from, April and May 2020, and everyone was looking at, everyone's going to go bust, and, the productivity is going to go downhill. But what did we actually see? Sarah, what's your experience around the last 2 years of, jumping from lockdown into office space? What was the reaction?
I think if we go back to March 2020, the initial reaction from a occupier perspective was very hesitant. So a lot of our clients were almost on a go slow. And at the time, I remember a number of landlords turning around and saying to me, "You're just being opportunistic. You're just trying to get more out of this deal." But I think especially those clients that were US headquartered or over in Europe, where there had already been a greater impact of COVID and they'd already started to see the impact on how they were using the office, that translated or that cascaded down to us here. And a lot of our clients really said, we need to see this play out and we're not sure what's going to happen. So I think the decision criteria to proceed with a new office or a lease renewal changed over that period. And I think by about April or May of that year, landlords were really starting to take COVID seriously. And I think that's when their perception shifted on what they needed to offer to start attracting tenants into their spaces, but also to retain tenants. Because tenants did start thinking, if I have a natural lease expiry, do we just send everybody home at this point? Do we wait for 12 months and see what happens and see if we can work from home effectively? And after that, does it then change our size requirement? Do we need an office in the CBD, or do we need a more metro location to support different employees? And that thought process definitely changed over time. So if we fast forward to, say, mid-2021, when we went back into the second lockdown, I think everyone's perception was different because they knew we could get through it. So companies that time were not as hesitant to make a decision. However, there certainly was a huge preference for organizations to renew leases rather than relocate and really look at those shorter term strategies for sure.
So just a follow-up question, I know a lot of people have asked me as to whether there was an uptick on the co-working spaces. Did people go for like a middle response of, going to metro offices or going into co-working spaces?
That is a really good question. And this is my personal view. I think there was a lot of hype in the media about these hub and spoke models. In reality, has it worked? No, because the spoke is essentially your home, right? So why would people go to these metro locations when in actual fact they've got that in their house? So I think it is really varied. We have certainly had clients who have left their and relocated out of their more traditional office space and are now in a more flexible environment where they can flex up and down subject to any changes in their headcount or if they acquire another business, for example. But for the most part, we haven't necessarily seen companies outside of those that were already engaged in that type of working change their approach to flex space so much.
Okay, no, thanks, Sarah. Jordan, just moving forward now into what is the current environment? We alluded to it before. What are people doing to bring their staff back into the office? Do staff actually want to work in the office? Is there a generational or an age-based difference? What are you seeing happening in the market at the moment?
I guess probably the first thing is, and I touched on it before, the meeting room thing. That's a real office design issue that's coming up. So a lot of companies, I know Atlassian, for example, they've got a policy that if one person is dialing into the meeting, everyone dials in. So you can't have 4 people in a meeting room physically and 2 dialing in, kind of separately. Every single person needs to be a floating head like we are today, just to create that kind of the feeling so that no one feels excluded, really. So on that basis, the whole layout of design of room designs, etc., need to change. And so you've just got a whole lot of single. I'm looking around to see, you can't see anything behind me, but a whole lot of single booths essentially, where people can do this and dial into. I'm in our boardroom, so this can fit 10 people. So this is just a waste of space for what I'm doing here. But I wanted kind of a nice room to speak to. But it's kind of having that layout, I guess, where everyone's able to dial in like this. The flip side of that is, if you spend a whole day doing that at the office, what's the point of even coming in? Like, you may as well do that from home. So I think that's kind of going to be one of the main challenges, where young people do want to come in and be mentored and led by their managers. But first, you've got to actually make sure they're there at the same time. There's no point kind of coming in. So it's kind of getting that coordination right in the first instance, so that you are there on the same day as your managers or other people you can learn from. But then also that you're not just spending the whole day stuck in Microsoft Team meetings and Zoom anyway, which is when you may as well be at home. That's probably our main thing. And obviously our sites don't have a choice there. They're at site, they're full time.
So it's interesting to see that there's a policy response as to what's work going to look like in the future in the office or at home. There's a policy change. And then there's the office layout. What's the physical environment that people work in? So it's interesting to see those two responses. Janine, what would you have to add to that in terms of what you're seeing your clients and BDO do currently about getting people into the office?
Okay, so there's a couple of things. First of all, I think when we moved into these lockdowns, it was we always talk in change management that you need a burning platform to drive change. And that was like the ideal burning platform to prove to, managers who in the past have been very reticent about, can I trust my employees to work from home? Will they be productive from home? Will we get the same outputs, etc.? That was like the best opportunity in the world to really test some of those assumptions and myths around flexible work. And what that's meant is it's a very different playing field now in terms of the discussion around, can we operate in a more flexible way? What do employees want? And how do we fulfill that from an organisational perspective? In our pre-chat, Sarah and Jordan and I were all talking about the fact that right now it's an employees market as well. So we're also dealing with the fact that most of our employees, at the blink of an eye, could go and get another job, and they can probably get paid more in that other job, and they're probably going to be attracted by a level of flexibility. So what I'm seeing now is organisations really have to rethink what flexible work looks like into the future, and that can be really challenging for some. So for us at BDO, I think we've got a good platform for opportunity there. We do need to think about some of the physical layouts. We need to think about some of the things we do to attract people back into the office, and when they're here, how do we capitalise on them being face-to-face and have more of those incidental interactions. But we also need to be much clearer around what are the expectations we have as an organisation, and what does that ideal level of flexibility look like, both for attracting and maintaining our staff morale and maintaining their employment with us, and also then as managers getting the best out of our teams and being able to make sure that we know when our teams are going to be face to face, when we're going to have 10 people on a Teams call, or all of those sorts of things. So there's a whole shift in the dynamic, and I think a lot of organizations are really at that point right now where they're trying to find their feet and trying to actually define that future and give some level of certainty to their employees around what that expectation will be.
And that's great. But what are some of the examples that we're seeing in the marketplace? Maybe Sarah, you've got some good examples from what you're seeing. What are people doing to bring people back into the office? Is it the breakfast bar? Is it the bean bags and the slippery slide? Like what are people doing?
This is something else we were just talking about pre everyone joining, so I guess I get to use the phrase. We were just debating. We were just debating the phrase "earn the commute," and I think that's very relative to what you've just raised, in that the employer or the business needs to earn the employee's commute time. So what are they doing to offset the lost time in travel? Well, we're seeing clients offer. Some are offering breakfast, some are offering lunch, some are offering drinks or different mentor speakers, guest speakers, guest speakers coming in to do lunch and learn series, for example. So I think employers are definitely coming up with creative ways to entice employees back into the office and to really earn the commute, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And Janine, you were talking earlier about what we had done at BDO with free coffees, and we have different stylized lunches that we put on. What are some of those examples?
Yeah, so absolutely. And to Sarah's point, we've got the breakfasts happening. And I think it's interesting because there's actually a couple of motivations behind those different those different opportunities. So one is, I think I'm seeing organisations want to incentivize people to come in. So yes, having a free breakfast, and we're trying to encourage our local coffee cart to stay. So we go and we shout everybody a coffee at 10 o'clock in the morning. Those sorts of things are great. But it's not just around earning the commute, to Sarah's point. It's actually also about, when people are in the office, how do we create those incidental opportunities to connect? And I think that's what I'm seeing more and more of as well. How do we make sure that people aren't just sitting in a cubicle on a Teams call all day, to Jordan's point? How do we make sure that they're, having the water cooler type discussions that we used to have, and creating connections, not just within their teams, because we know that all of these sort of setups that we have, well, that we can talk to our team members if we're working on a job. We know that we can do that efficiently. What we can't necessarily do as efficiently working from home is create the broader fabric of the culture that goes beyond the immediate work teams. So the incidental discussions of the fact that today I was sitting next to, a team member from corporate finance who I've never met before, and we would never have an incidental conversation because we would never see a need to meet together on Teams. So it's those sorts of things I'm seeing. Definitely changes in terms of office space. So I'm seeing a lot of my clients are saying, how do we invest in making this environment feel better? How do we make sure that, the cubicles feel a little bit more spacious, to Jordan's point, that people don't feel like they're on top of each other and that therefore they've got more risks from a work health and safety perspective for COVID. Making sure that the tea rooms and the lunch rooms and all of those spaces invite people to come and sit and stay and talk and connect. So I'm seeing lots of those sorts of things. And then I'm seeing more people investing in developing guidelines around what flexible work looks like for their organisation, to really help set those rules and guidelines and expectations in place for how we move things forward.
Mm-hmm.
That's really, sorry to jump in, that's really consistent with what we're seeing as well. And we have a lot of our clients that are trying to encourage employees in from, say, 10 a.m. till 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, so that there is a specific time for them to connect, and acknowledging that people may have drop-offs for children, they may have after-school activities. And other clients have even gone as far as to say we can't schedule meetings with them between those hours as well, just in case we disturb the natural flow of people's routines, which I thought was really interesting.
Do you know what I find fascinating about this as well is, as I said earlier, before COVID, flexible work and part-time work and all of those things were often the working mum type discussion. And if you weren't a working mum and you were trying to look for flexible work options, it felt a little harder. It felt less natural. It felt like you had to, prove why your reasons for flexible work were different, which has a twofold impact. One, it means that working mums become a bit more of a second-class citizen because they're the ones who are always, not available exactly when you need them. But also that that the broader talent pools were sitting there feeling like they couldn't get those same opportunities and they couldn't get that work-life balance. What we're seeing now is a real shift, and that diversity inclusion, I think, is so much easier because, to your point, Sarah, everybody's got something. We've created patterns of work now where we actually know that some people have things on in the mornings now. That's how they work, and they may prefer to work later at night. So we're putting in place, I feel like we have leapt forward 10 years in terms of our ability to really create far more diverse workplaces and opportunities. So I'd love to see how
I
that
100% agree. I was on maternity leave last year and only came back into the office on 1st of November. And I think COVID and the outcomes of COVID have been huge in my return to work and how I'm able to work more flexibly to support my family now.
Yeah, that's
And we've got
fantastic.
also the difference between flexibility and hybrid. I think that they're
Yes.
often two kind of confused words. So everything here is talking about flexibility as opposed to a hybrid, which is it could be the 60-40, Tuesdays at home and Fridays at home and Monday, Wednesday, Thursday at the office. So I think I think there's a fair bit of confusion out there at the moment between what each one is and how companies deal with each of those. We like to say we've been flexible forever. Flexibility is a values. For us, it's more about a values-based thing. Like you said, you've got to go and pick up the kids on a certain day, or they've got a swimming carnival on, or whatever it may be. That's flexibility. Whereas hybrid is a much more formal. It's nearly a contractual arrangement, which means that you're at home on these 2 days or whatever it may be. So I think just getting some clarity around that and how that works for your organisations as well is really important.
I love how you raise that, Jordan, because even that sort of word around contracting and those sorts of things, I'm seeing real differences in organisations in terms of their level of flexibility and hybrid being a component of that. So I'm seeing some organisations where, from a leadership perspective, it is very much I want you back in the office. We're out of it now. I want to go back to where we were pre-2020, which I think is a challenge for most organisations to get to that point, if that's where they're going. Then you have the really next level of, you know what, we don't even need an office anymore. Everybody can work wherever they like, and I don't care if you move to Perth, as long as you can deliver on the outputs. And then we're seeing these levels in between of a level of hybrid sort of working, where yes, there is some who are saying you can officially work from home up to 2 days a week. So they've got fairly structured hybrid, and some who are quite low structured and saying, as long as you meet your needs, the needs of the role, then I don't mind how many days in or out you are, you can decide on the day. So we're seeing a complete array of from every level of completely structured to completely non-structured.
Janine, it's interesting. We had this chat with Sarah yesterday around what some of the pitfalls are of contracting or not effectively contracting. And Sarah, you'd mentioned the idea that a lot of people are going, I could work in Byron Bay from now on.
Yes.
But you had Perth, to Janine's point. But there are pitfalls of that. Do you want to just go into that before we go into another topic?
I guess what we discussed yesterday was specific examples of this, and I won't mention any of the companies of name by name, of course, but I have had clients who have told me that during COVID they had employees relocate from Sydney, for example, to Byron Bay, and since the pandemic has ended and they've been encouraged back to the office, the employee has asked for the employer to pay for their flights to bring them back into the office. And there seems to be a huge debate around, is this something the employer has to do, especially because we are in an employees market. But in actual fact, what this client did anyway was think, hold on a minute, you no longer live in a tier 1 city, so I'm no longer going to pay you a tier 1 wage. And if you want to come into the office, then you're going to need to pay for transport yourself. So I know I've spoken with other clients who have said had different opinions on this. So it is very varied, but it's really hard to know how you manage this. but also then what the implications are from even an insurance perspective of having someone work in a different location or remotely for that period.
It's fascinating to think about those pitfalls that you may not otherwise think about. But before I'd like to move on to other topics. I love the fact that we've naturally moved on to the human element and we've moved away from the built environment of office space. This is all very critical. But if we think about bringing people back into the office, yes, we've got flexibility or hybrid arrangements, but why is there a future in office? Why is there a need to bring people back into the office? And I'd like to just focus in on that, from a mental health perspective, from just a cultural perspective, and maybe a career progression perspective. Janine, could you talk to that a bit?
I'd love to. So, I have always had my team work in a fairly flexible way, lots of hybrid working. I've always said, I don't mind where you work from as long as you get your job done. But what you're absolutely right in pointing out, Andreas, is that there are significant impacts to that. One thing is, I don't know about you, Jordan, and you, Sarah, if you have big teams reporting into you, but when you have significantly sized teams, a lot of the pressure ends up coming into that manager role. So there's a huge weight on your shoulders. And Andreas, I think you and I both experienced during lockdown just the energy that goes into managing a team remotely, the kinds of things you need to do to make sure that the energy is being shared across the team, to make sure that you're having the interactions that you may not naturally have when you're outside of the office. So there's a lot, I think, that falls on the weight of the manager that is harder sometimes to manage remotely. There is absolutely the mental health issues that sometimes you're not necessarily going to be aware of the cues when you're seeing people only for brief moments in time on certain, on screens, etc. You don't necessarily connect as easily, and you don't necessarily see some of the cues that might help you understand that a person's under pressure or struggling within a role. And there are also challenges around development. Now, I had 2 grads start during lockdown, and I will say they have done an amazing job, and they're amazing team members and perform excellently. But I can also see that some of the incidental learning that you have when you're just sitting in a team environment and you can say, hey, Alana, come and have a look at what I'm doing here, or why don't you just walk in and sit on this presentation with me? Some of those incidental learning opportunities aren't there. I don't think they're insurmountable, so I don't look at it as a reason as to why everybody needs to be back in the office all the time. But for me, when I look at organisations as they grow larger and as you have more complexity, a level of interconnectivity, a space that you do call your home space, and where you can create those opportunities beyond your immediate teams, I think becomes still more and more critical. So I don't see BDO moving away from having an office, much as my team work incredibly flexibly and have a lot of time working from home.
Yeah. Sarah, I'll ask you to jump in just so that you can start moving your hands around and getting your light working.
I'm going to try and be really subtle.
That's right. But what about the whole career aspect and this idea that can you get effective mentorship if you're not in the office? What is the idea of coming into the office just to actually learn more and pick up from someone's phone conversation or what your boss is currently working on? There's a lot to be said about that.
So much to be said, and as Janine said, it is those incidental learnings that I think are so important, especially in developing our younger employees and seeing them grow through the ranks. And I mean, my view is that as we progress over the next couple of years and we're still in this state of I guess a hybrid working environment, I do think that there is going to be a greater benefit to our younger employees to be in the office where they can learn. And I do think, whether right or wrong, it may get to a point where the employees that are in the office may be the ones that are more quickly promoted because they're front of sight and they're front of mind. So I think we need to really need to carefully consider how no one gets left behind because they may choose to work from home or they may be more productive working from home. So I think there's 2 thought processes as to how it will play out, but I'm thinking more from my team and how we operate, and the importance of being together to share that market information and what is happening with different landlord groups, with different companies, etc. That there's so much value in that collaboration and being together as a team.
Mm. And I think, Jordan, this speaks to your point about the fairness, where yes, we want to be flexible, we want to give everyone their own environment to work in, and that's great. But what about if someone can't work from home? He's your site supervisor, he'd love to work from home, he's got kids to pick up as well, but he or
Yeah.
she might want to do all those things, but they can't.
Yeah, it's a real challenge that we're trying to navigate at the moment, and even in our kind of head office roles, how do we, if we do have a rule for the site people, how do we then have a rule for someone else? But then they're obviously, our head office roles could go and work at a bank, our HR team could work at a bank, our finance team could work at a tech company, and they're offering kind of full hybrid. So it's kind of how we juggle all of that. But probably one of the big things, I was at the property conference last week in Hobart, and one of the CEOs of REITs, I forget which one, said that values are caught, not taught. And so just being kind of present and being with people, you can't teach someone your company values. You can't teach someone what you stand for. They need to kind of be immersed in it. And we're a family business, and we've had 100, I think in the last 12 months, we've had about 100 new starters. And so in the last probably 2 months, we've gone on a bit of a roadshow in terms of trying to get out and just kind of meet all the new people and for them to find out what we're about. That face-to-face connection, doing that over a camera is really hard. And as a minimum, it's it's somewhat organized and kind of set up, but as a worst case, it's nearly a bit unnatural and the like. So we're really trying to get out and just getting out to sites and trying to get back traveling again and actually seeing the people and letting them know what we're about and what we stand for. But probably as well on the phone calls, well, we've got quite a big cadet program, and they start in the estimating department, and that's where they're picking up the phones to subcontractors all day and asking for prices. And the benefit of them sitting next to their manager or whoever it may be is if they do make a mistake, because they can be pretty big mistakes at estimating time. Like someone
Yes.
goes to have on the shoulder and say, "Oh no, you've missed that one there. Maybe just next time say this or that." So it's those little things that we're missing, potentially missing the opportunity from with too much of the work from home, as opposed to a hybrid perspective. And also just that same cadet could be a bit worried about picking up the phone. They might think it's a stupid question, and there's no such thing as a stupid question, but it's very different just going and walking over to your boss and just saying, "Oh, how do I do this?" They could spend half a day at home trying to work it out and get nowhere and the like, because they didn't want to pick the phone up, and because it's just a bit of a bigger ask. So it's a really challenging issue that isn't obviously unique to any of us. It applies to all of us.
So while the whole idea of flexibility has matured, to Janine's point earlier, I think it's great to see that flexibility has now become part of our natural rhythms. There are things to consider about bringing people back into the office for their own good and for the good of the culture and the environment that we work in. One thing that we haven't touched on yet is, talking about environment, is the whole ESG concept. And I know it's a big issue in terms of employees now asking for, what is my employer doing in the ESG space? Are we being sustainable? I had someone talk to me today about, it's ludicrous to think we're going to be sitting in traffic for the next hour and a half, only basically to do the same thing that we could be doing at home. And you sit in traffic, you see all the other cars, what are we doing here? And so there is that concept. Don't want to lose focus on time, but Janine, just in a sentence or two, what are you seeing in terms of staff and their requirements around ESG of their employer?
Look, I think it's a really interesting topic, and it's probably a whole webinar that you could do on this topic alone, because to your point, Andreas, our staff, especially the next sort of generations, are really very motivated by many of the aspects of ESG, and absolutely commuting is one of them. Having big cities, the way we are, giving back to our communities locally, all of those are important topics. And I think it comes as part of this discussion around flexible work and how flexible work or hybrid work can actually play a role in your ESG responsibilities. It also plays out significantly in how organisations are attracting talent. And I think what I'm seeing is staff are looking for organisations who have a culture and values that align to their own values, and ESG is a really important part of that. So I think all of these elements will need to be coming together far more coherently than many organisations have done in the past to be able to present a real picture for employees as to the company that they're joining and how that really relates to their own belief systems and their own objectives in life.
Mm. And to your point, Janine, we could fill a whole seminar or webinar with the topic of ESG. And funny you say that, because our very next webinar is going to be on ESG and real estate. So
I
stay
just
tuned
need
for
to
that one.
say, I didn't know that. I didn't actually feed into
Fantastic.
that.
Even better. I'll pay you after. The other thing that we haven't touched on really is how the landlord is responding to all of this. And Sarah, I'm just wondering if you have any examples as to, yes, the importance of end of trip facilities, we understand that, but what else can the landlord do to make sure that tenant brings their staff back, to make sure that the tenant increases, hopefully, their environment, their office space? What are you seeing in that?
That is a great question, and we are seeing a variety of initiatives being implemented by landlords across the board. Funnily enough, the building that I'm in, there was actually a earring making workshop the other week, which I thought was quite creative. So landlords are coming up with different initiatives, different events where they can really help support their tenants in supporting their employees back into the office. So I'm seeing a lot more networking drinks where buildings are encouraging their tenants to get together for a meet and greet. Previously, this wasn't something that was done. It was almost more attributed to the flex providers who would create an environment for their members or their license holders to interact together. So for buildings to be offering this, I think it's a really good step forward. There's always the free yoga, there's free Pilates, although I am very conscious that there is a charge that is probably attributed to the outgoing. So at some level, the tenant is going to be paying for it. But it is interesting to see that landlords are really thinking what they can do to help attract tenants. We've even had, or we've even seen ice cream vans brought into offices, or just celebrating. I think Harmony Day was the other week, and then Valentine's Day, for example, just bringing more atmosphere and really trying to create more of an environment in any of those communal spaces.
Yeah, that's great to see. So the landlord does have a role in all of this.
Well,
Sorry,
I just
Janine.
saw our landlord is offering holiday camps for kids. So presumably, and I'm sure I didn't see that pre-COVID, I would have noticed. So things like that, where it's encouraging, I might spend the next 2 weeks working from home because I'll have the kids home. Whereas presumably if they're doing those sorts of things, then you're more likely to see employees coming back into the office, or buildings, tenants coming back in. So it'd be interesting to see how those sorts of things play out.
Yeah.
Great ideas. Great ideas. We are coming up to 10 minutes to go. It seems like we've answered all the questions that our audience has had so far, because I haven't seen any come through. But please write them into the chat box if you have any questions that you want us to answer. But while people are writing those up, I thought we should actually pull together all of this collective knowledge that we've gained through this hour, and just say, what do we think is going to be the future of office space? We've heard about the environment that we've come from prior to COVID, what COVID has accelerated. We talked about the human element. what is it that we're going to see in the future as a result of all of this? And I might start with Sarah. Do you want to just wrap things up and tell us your goal, your crystal ball?
Yeah, sure. So my view is that there is going to be a need for the office going forward, but what I think is going to be most important is how occupiers structure their leases going forward to afford them the most flexibility. So I think occupiers really need to concentrate on securing break rights, for example, expansion rights, contraction rights, looking at having interdependent leases for single floors so that if you need to, you can dispose of a floor at any one time, or you can assign a single lease but still retain the rest of the space. So I think flexibility is going to be key going forward. And at the moment, it is a very tenant favorable market. So it's an opportune time to secure flexibility within a lease. So certainly a consideration. But in terms of the size and I guess a company's desire to understand the space that they occupy, I don't think we're going to see a huge shift in the reduction of the space, purely because the space, people still have a need for their own desk or their own environment, so to speak. So I don't think we'll see a huge shift in that either. Sorry, that's a very quick summary.
That is a very quick summary, but it's good. It talks to some very pertinent points. We might just because we've got a bit of time, just expand on that, because we haven't really talked about the structuring of the leases, but it's very important that, traditionally we would have a 5 plus 5 plus another 5 maybe on top. You're now talking about there is, landlords are affording us some flexibility as tenants to allow us to increase the size and decrease the size. Maybe talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, no problem. So if we look at, say, development buildings initially, if an occupier is looking at a development building, then there's certainly opportunity to look at contraction and expansion in advance of practical completion. So that's something that's always kind of been afforded to tenants. But if we push past that now, a lot of our clients are still securing those growth and contraction rights through the lease terms as well at certain intervals to maximize that flexibility. If we take it away from development sites and just look at more of the existing buildings, we are certainly seeing lease structures. Historically, they were 3 or 5 years, or 5 years plus 5 with the option, as you said. But now we are seeing, say, a 4-year lease with a break at the end of year 2, or 8 years with a break at the end of year 5. So there's a lot more willingness from the landlord to work with the tenant to understand what the drivers are of the business and what they're trying to achieve, and to ensure that that flexibility is then brought into the lease. And people don't know how this is going to impact them. So pre-COVID, landlords would say, if you want the expansion space, then why do you need a break? Because surely if you're forecasting that much growth, you can't be forecasting that you're actually going to have a significant decline in headcount as well. Whereas at the moment, there are a lot of unknowns. People are still forecasting growth, but they're also forecasting that there may be this change in working that necessitates a reduction in space. So I think that's probably where we're seeing the biggest mental shift from landlords and tenants, and having these more open dialogues that previously it was a no, this is market standard, this is how we do something. So much more conversation and flexibility now.
And if you had to put your finger in the wind, would you say we're going to see more space or less space being used going forward?
I think tenants for the most part will, I mean, so long as their headcount doesn't change, I expect that they will retain a very similar floor space, because they're going to be using the workspace in a different way. If you take away the number of desks, then you need to increase the amount of collaboration space. You need to consider the circulation space so that you're not impacting that safety and making people feel like they're on top of each other. So I do think if we're talking about a like-for-like headcount, that the space requirement will essentially stay the same. And even organizations that are talking about having a 75% occupancy, for example, a lot of them are saying their employees want their own desk during that time. Or if you're encouraging every employee to come in on at 10 till 3 on a Wednesday, where are they going to sit? So I think there's a lot of considerations into how the office needs to work in supporting this hybrid arrangement and really understanding what the goals of the organisation are before they define what their footprint should look like.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thanks, Sarah.
You're welcome.
Jordan, what's your summarising comment on all of this?
I think you'd be crazy to say that the role of the office hasn't changed. And it's been driven by the tech companies and the like, and they obviously have a vested interest in as well in people working from home, because their products then get out there. The same way we've got a vested interest in bigger offices and newer buildings and the like. But I think, yeah, the office is no doubt has become a place for collaboration. But I do think kind of overall, it's still too early to say whether the hybrid actually works, in terms of we haven't had that comparable years of data over, like if you're running any experiment, you need a test group and a control group, and we haven't had the years of data yet. So we might look back in 2 years' time and say, oh my God, what do we all do? That's probably not going to be the answer, but I still think to actually, I don't have a crystal ball, but I still think there's probably a few more chapters to write into exactly how this will all play out. That's kind of my 2 cents.
I think you're right,
excellent.
Jordan. Like, how do you plan when there's still health orders in place to a degree?
Yeah, there's so much. It feels like to me there's still so much unknown, and until we've actually had years of comparable data without COVID impacted results and without job keepers and the like, I just still don't know exactly what.
I think you're totally right. I don't think we've arrived at the new normal yet. I know we have people that have that get COVID on a regular basis, and in terms of family, friends, and staff, it's still around, and so you can't really predict the future until that's actually been taken care of in a proper way. So Jordan, follow-up question: are we going to be all sitting in Google-type offices in the next 2 years, or are we going to, see just that collaborative space that you mentioned, but not going overboard with foosball tables and the like?
I think it'll be that collaborative space. I'd say if I had to make a bet right now, it will be that kind of 60-40 hybrid blend. That'd be my gut feel, but I'm not 100% there yet. That's actually going to be what plays out. But at the same time, some people do like having that separation between work, and especially if they're working more from home, you probably don't need the tennis, the table tennis tables and the like.
Yes,
they've kind of got that. If they want to have fun, they're at home already. Work then does really become a place for kind of gathering people, but really working and heading home. But to each their own. There's a lot of people saying, I met my husband or I met my wife at work, and how am I going to do that if I'm working from home? So there's plenty of stories like that.
Excellent. No, thanks, Jordan. That's great. And Janine, over to you. Just a final comment.
So I agree with everything Sarah and Jordan have said, except I would add that much as I agree we haven't done the official sort of studies, and we might find that there are some inefficiencies, etc. I also feel like going back to an expectation of people coming back into the office is rather like trying to shove the tissues back into the box after the kids have pulled them all out. I think regardless of whether it officially works or not, the fact of the matter is most of our employees have a level of expectation. Certainly while the market is like it is now, that's going to continue to drive that level of expectation that they have in terms of being able to create ways of working that suits them. So I think what we're going to have to see is organisations working really closely to understand that human element, to be really planned in what they want that human interactive element to be like, and then working really closely with your Jordans and Sarahs of the world to try to make sure that you're finding and building spaces that are actually going to suit that. So I think you're going to start to see, I mean, people and culture should have already been very interlinked and involved in these sorts of discussions. But I think there's a lot of work our people and culture teams need to be doing with senior executives to really articulate what that future culture needs to look like, and then making sure that those cultural elements are being shared with the people who are helping us find and design the right working spaces into the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Janine. Look, we are right on time. We have answered all the questions that have come through in that process, and just put your focus on the upcoming series. So there is that ESG in real estate webinar coming up. Thanks, Janine, for that plug earlier. Build to rent, funding for the future. Please sign up. You can already sign up for those sessions now. But once again, thank you very much to our panelists, and a very fascinating discussion around the future. I think it is about the person. There is going to be a fair but flexible work option that needs to be designed. I think it's not about foreseeing the future, but rather being able to react to the environment that we're in. I think that's going to be the new normal going forward. So thanks again for joining us today. We did end up being a bit short on time, but great discussions were had. So thank you very much to our panelists and for our audience for attending today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you, Andreas.
Thanks,
Thank
Sarah and
you.
Jordan. Lovely meeting you.
You too. Oh,
Bye.
perfect
Thanks,
timing.
The lights going off.
Perfect timing.